Frank Adloff is a professor of sociology and teaches at the University of Hamburg. Frank is a co-director of the Center for Advanced Studies, Futures of Sustainability. His research currently focuses on the theory of gift giving, on conviviality, sustainability, and civil society. Among his latest publications are Gifts of Cooperation, Mouse and Pragmatism, London 2016, and Politik der Gabe für ein anderes Zusammenleben, Hamburg 2018. And he will talk about nature and society in the Anthropocene, gifts, conviviality, and symbioses.
It's really nice to be invited to the conference. Unfortunately, I couldn't come, and that is really a pity. But I'm grateful that I can give this presentation via Skype, which is not very good, but better maybe than nothing. And I got a little bit of an idea what the presentations before me were about. I heard some keywords like Gaia, Donna Haraway, multi-species studies, relation and ontology, and so on. And I will also touch upon the topics, but I'm not quite sure if we talk about the same because I'm not so familiar with Portuguese and Spanish. So I just got some ideas, but I'm not really sure what the talks especially were about. So my talk is about nature and society in the Anthropocene, gifts, conviviality, and symbiosis. And what I try to do is to present some conceptual thoughts to you on the topic, how can sociology think about the relations between human actors and nature? And as we, I guess, already heard before, this topic becomes more urgent today because we live in the state, in the chronological age of the Anthropocene, and that is the age of climate change, of loss of biodiversity, and we live in a very, very deep ecological crisis right now. And that is the background of the talk. What does that mean for the social sciences then? I think that the major ideas, what the concept of the Anthropocene means, are very well known today. So I can keep it very, very briefly what the challenge of the Anthropocene is. So according to natural scientists, we live in a new geochronological age. Humanity has become a geophysical force. And the question is still, when did this new age begin? There are several approaches tackling with this question, but more or less, my impression is that there's a consensus among natural scientists that the Anthropocene began around the year 1950. And that is also the beginning of the so-called great acceleration, for example, the acceleration of CO2 emissions. So what is the main idea? The main idea is that no longer exists nature as a stable background for human activity. The background becomes a volatile foreground now. Or put it into another word, nature is maybe now changing faster than society is. And that has severe consequences for our thinking about humanity, history, and nature. For example, the historian Dipesh Chakrabarty made the point that the difference between natural history and human history no longer holds today. Humans intervene in natural history, and there cannot be any division anymore between natural history and human history. Or take, for example, the philosopher Clive Hamilton. He put it like this, that human will is now injected into nature. So our concept of a division between nature and society or culture is problematic right now. If we have a look into the Anthropocene discourse, we can see various strands of discourses within the overarching topic of the Anthropocene. To put it very bluntly, we can either zoom into the concept of the Anthropocene or we can zoom out. The first approach is to say that humanity is a too broad category. That is normally the take of the social sciences, of the humanities, and so on. They point out that it is not humanity as a totality that is responsible for the ecological crisis, but parts of humanity are responsible for that. That is the reason why people talk about the Capitalocene, pointing out that it is capitalism as an economic system responsible for the CO2 emissions and so on. Or they talk about the Technocene, focusing on technology, or they focus on the Anglocene, like the Anglo-Saxon countries were the first that were industrialized and so on. There, the main argument is that we have to zoom into humanity and make differentiations and talk about social inequalities. The other strand within the discourse is that humanity alone is a too narrow category. That is the point Deepa Chakravarty has made, that we need to integrate Earth history and non-humans. And that is really a radical challenge for the humanities and the social sciences. And my focus today is on that point and not on the first one, that humanity is a too broad category. I would like to take serious the idea that we have to talk about humanity vis-a-vis other entities like nature, non-human beings, and so on. So my take is that the sociological focus on human society or human culture alone is insufficient. We could also ask the question, if we now, in the age of the Anthropocene, we as social scientists, do we have to become ecologists? And my answer would be yes. So what is needed is a critique of Western ontology with its subject-object division. It is still necessary, one could say, because we already know this critique. It's a very old critique. It began in the early 20th century with the philosophies, for example, of John Dewey, Heidegger, or Whitehead. But it is still needed because sociology is very much dedicated to the division between subjects and objects. When we want to know what is the state of Western modernity, of Western ontology, Western practices, it is fruitful to have a look at two important contributions to the debate. And the two contributions come from Bruno Latour and Philippe Descola. They point out that modernity rests on a conceptual division between nature and culture. For example, Philippe Descola pointed out that we live in a kind of a mononaturalism on the one hand and multiculturalism on the other hand in the West. That means that we assume that there's only one nature, which is defined via the natural sciences, and on the other hand, we are confronted with a multiplicity of cultures. So behind this is the old division between matter and spirit. And Bruno Latour's point on within this debate was that the moderns who rely on such a conceptual division don't do what they say and don't say what they do. Modernity actually rests on the expansion of hybrids. So there's something in between. There's not only the concept of nature and then culture, but in between something is going on, and Latour doesn't want to distinguish between objects and subjects. That has been very fruitful for social theory. All the STS studies, science and technology studies, rest on the idea that we should not distinguish anymore between objects and subjects. Latour came up with a, I think, very valuable political theory that points out, that makes the claim that all non-human entities have to be represented politically. For example, he speaks in his latest writings, like the struggle around Gaia and so on, that we need alliances with oceans, for example, with the forests, with animals, and many, many other entities. But the problem with this theory is that it rests on a problematic social theory. I think that we still need to distinguish between different types of entities and not put everything into one bottle. So there's a difference, for example, between humans, animals, plants, ecosystems, or matter, or artifacts, or technology. And one of the main differences which we shouldn't get rid of is the difference between living entities and non-living entities. I think that it is still crucial to have this difference, because when we have the idea that there should be something like a solidarity between humans and non-human actors, solidarity is only possible among living beings, would be my claim. So that is a problem with Latour. Descola has another problem. He stereotypes the West. When he speaks of mononaturalism in the West, he thinks that the scientific and materialist mononaturalism is very, very dominant. But this is not the only understanding of nature within Western cultures. Think of example of the traditions of phenomenology or romanticism. These traditions, intellectual traditions, but also lived traditions, point to an alternative understanding. Within these kind of entanglement with the world, we are really engaging with the world. We live in a second person mode, you could say. There's an I-you relationship. It's about dwelling, it's about holistic experiences. There's no subject-object divisions. So you could say that there is another kind of tradition within Western tradition which is not so often acknowledged. And that is a kind of an undercurrent of an animistic nature, you could say. And you could make the claim that the disenchantment of the world, everybody is familiar with this term by Max Weber, that the disenchantment of the world is not totally accomplished yet. However, mainstream modernity has reduced non-human life to the mechanical. Think, for example, of intensive mass animal farming, think of the agro-industry, think of animal testing, or think of laboratory behavioral sciences. What happened there during the 20th century is that life is removed from relations of embeddedness. Non-humans are seen as devoid of subjectivity, of intentionality. They don't have a freedom of action, it is said, or they don't show any meaning. Or think, for example, of Max Weber's very, very famous distinction between action and behavior. Action is typical of humans, and we only are interested in action or social action as sociologists, and everything which is behavior is excluded from the social sciences. What I'm aiming at is a new standard model, a standard model of interaction which ascribes subjectivity also to animals and plants, and that we see that there's an interaction with them, that it is not an object. We don't act upon them only, but we interact with them. And this kind of alternative model is already rooted, my claim is, in Western life worlds. And that corresponds now with new recent developments in the national sciences. One could say that there's already a revolutionary change going on in the natural sciences right now. Think of, for example, think of the discussion around matter in the so-called new materialism of Barat or Bennett. Matter is seen as created, or other scholars point out right now that life shows subjectivity, intelligence, feelings, and there's a new focus on symbiotic cooperation. There are many, many authors pointing towards these directions in the field of posthumanism, but also in the field of biology, that is, within the natural sciences themselves. Just a few examples. Think, for example, of the already mentioned human-animal studies or multi-species studies. Or there's another interesting field evolving, which is called biosemiotics, which points out, from the standpoint of biology, that there are sign processes within and between living organisms. This strand of research rests on main ideas of the pragmatist Charles Sanders Peirce, for example, and Eduardo Cohn researched within this kind of tradition and focuses on the interaction between non-humans and human beings, and points out that life is based on sign processes, not on symbolic signs, but on iconic and indexical signs, at least. Then we can see that symbioses are a new paradigm in biology. It started in the 1960s and 70s with the very, very influential research of Lynn Margulis, who at that time was still an outsider, but now she seems to be a visionary when she pointed out early in the 1970s that symbiosis is a basis for all processes of life. Take, for example, the quote you see on the slide, "We are all lichens," which appeared in an article by 3 biologists in 2012. To sum that up, life is world-forming. Nature acts in a world-creating manner, and these worlds overlap. There are contact points between them. I would like to argue against anthropocentrism and mechanocentrism from the standpoint of anthropomorphism. So what we could do now is to assume a kind of a pan-psychic approach, that there is a kind of a similarity between the anthropos, the humanity, and non-human actors, and that is also a kind of a decentering approach. It is not an anthropocentric approach anymore. My purpose is to develop a kind of sociological approach that understands the processes of life as a flow of gifts back and forth. So what I intend is to extend the idea of the gift, the paradigm of the gift, to interaction with non-humans. I cannot elaborate on that. Just a few remarks. I rely on the idea of the gift, which was developed by Marcel Mauss in the 1920s, and later on in the 1980s and 90s up to the present, was developed by the French Mauss movement. It's an acronym and stands for Mouvement Anti-Utilitariste dans les Sciences Sociales, anti-utilitarian movement in the social sciences. And also I'd like to rely on the concept, the political concept, the normative concept of convivialism. It's a kind of a political program which was developed a few years ago. So, and this program is normally dedicated to redescribe relationships between human actors. But what I like to propose is a kind of a methodological and enlightened animism, which rests on the idea that, except in modern scientific culture, relationships with nature are always thought of as gift relationships. So what we could do in sociology is to consider methodologically non-human beings as quasi-subjects and recognize them as givers. And that is already rooted, I would say, in common life worlds. So the objective would be to shed light on partnerships and alliances, and these kinds of alliances I would like to call convivial alliances with non-human beings. These partnerships are not only harmonious, they can have an agonistic side as a gift, can also have an agonistic side. There's a kind of conflict going on between partners who are engaged in gift relationships. So that is a very, very important point to have to hold in mind, that there can be agonistic and non-agonistic partnerships. Then the concept of conviviality has some normativity in it. I would say we can distinguish between a minimal kind of normativity within conviviality to a more normative loading concepts, to non-utilitarian cooperation among equals across social borders and so on. That is another discussion, but my main idea is that we do not only find conviviality among human beings, but we can speak of conviviality in a multi-species way. And one subcategory of conviviality is symbiosis. I rely on the biological term of symbiosis, which means we can identify among humans and non-humans interspecies cooperation, which is positive for both sides, for both species. So it's a mutualism within symbiosis. Think, for example, of organic farming, which acknowledges the symbiotic reality much more than industrial agriculture. Just one caveat. So I already said there is an agonistic side within gift giving, but not all gift relationships are positive. So the positive side of the gift relationship consists of giving, accepting, and returning between a giver and a person or a subject who receives something and returns something. But there can be also a negative side within the gift relationship. For example, if you only take and withhold the things you received, you exploit others. Or think of the mutual giving of harm, which is a negative side of a gift cycle. Climate catastrophe can be seen as mutual giving of harm. Humans give harm to nature, and nature strikes back, as Latour describes in his book on Gaia, for example. I come to an end and to a summary. What I'm arguing against is human exceptionalism. So the sociological project of the 20th century is also a project of ignorance towards nature, and maybe also a project of destruction of nature. Instead, we should focus on interdependent biosocial collectives, I propose. That means recognizing non-human givers through methodological animism. And the central concepts I propose for that is a gift theory, a theory of conviviality, and the idea of interspecies symbiosis. So my main claim is then that a non-dualistic ontology is already existent within Western life worlds. It is based on the idea of gift giving, and that could also be an adequate starting point for social theory. There's no need to follow mononaturalism sociologically, so no need to follow only the natural scientific idea of mononaturalism and this mechanic idea, which is already under attack within the natural sciences themselves, as I tried to point out a few minutes ago. And this helps acknowledging interdependencies of life forms. So what I propose is that the analysis of human social relations, that is sociology, is only a subcategory of a general sociology of ecological relations. So I propose more interdisciplinary dialogues and an opening of the social sciences. I thank you for your attention.